it's a kind of, obviously it's a question or a topic that's compelling enough for you to spend some time reflecting on, and Claire really appreciate it. Just to give you some background, Claire's quite right, she was interviewing me on her SLOW project, and she was interested in issues around contemplative psychology or contemplation. And the reason why I wanted to just quickly briefly talk about this is it's only right for me to kind of tell you where I stand or where I come from. I think that's only the right thing to do when one enters into dialogue. Is that? Yep. So just to give you an idea, I'm both a scientist, so I'm a psychologist who's published 30, 40 peer-reviewed papers, including the British Medical Journal, Comprehensive Psychiatry, and all those, you know, neurotic, overachieving kind of things that Western people say are important. But I know the experience of science, so my PhD was using structural equations modelling, which is a very advanced form of modelling psychotic illness. So I know what an a priori hypothesis looks like, and I also know what post hoc evaluation does as a way of actually making quite convenient fictions about science if you inflate type 1 error. So that's one side about science. The other side is that we were talking about contemplation and contemplative psychology. Now, I'm a practitioner of the centering prayer approach, which is a form of Christian meditation, which comes from the early desert fathers and mothers of the 1st and 2nd century of the Christian tradition. So it's not the same as the Buddhist stuff, but it's a form of contemplation. And I've been meditating for 13 years, and our little group just finished, because we meet every Wednesday, it's about 20-25 of us, at the Angelus bell at 6 o'clock. So the Angelus bell was, and still is, rung around Western culture as a signifier of the transition of night into day, and you'll also have that if you go up to New Norcia. Now, what's that got to do with anything? Well, also I gave a number of presentations called The Monk and the Psychologist up in New Norcia with John Herbert, who's now Abbot John Herbert. When he was just a monk, he's now an abbot. And the funny thing was that I was speaking more about theology and spirituality, and he was speaking more about psychology because he was studying pastoral work, and I was reading about contemplative practices, you see. But we had these wonderful dialogues over 3 years between the monastic contemplative tradition of the church that I belong to, and science and a whole bunch of things. So I come from that place, that's where I stand, or at least that is my inheritance, if that's okay. So I'll be sort of talking about those things. So I'm both interested about science and spirituality and religion. And if we're going to talk about Western dreaming or Western cosmology, we can't avoid those topics. Yeah? So we have to somehow come to some dialogue around our issues of what it is that we believe in. Now, when I mean what it is that we believe in, I'm not interested about what you believe in. All right? That's usually the reflexive natural response of somebody from the West. Us, I'm talking about. Now, as an industrial psychologist, I work as a private consultant. I work in very large industry and very large infrastructure projects. I don't talk like this to my clients. I'd never get any work. It just wouldn't happen. But I work with very large, like, I'll just tell you anyway, the New Perth-Bunbury Highway, the $750 million road down there, the Gateway project, which is the one that does from the airport to here, it's $1 billion, and Elizabeth Quays, I was involved in just starting off some of the work for the Max Light Rail project, right? So I work with these very large, bullish, tough, strong industries and very complex problems with local councils and state and federal government. So I don't talk this language there, but I come from here in order to assist them to do something that I'm particularly interested in, which a philosopher, Mark Kindrell, and others are concerned about, which is our increasing inability towards collective action, which is what is it about us and our inability to actually get together, to do stuff together. And I want to talk about that because it seems that we're failing to come together as a culture because there is lots of different ways of seeing the world. Yep. To me, this seems to revolve around creed, which is what we believe in. And I will be talking about some of those things. So if there are things that upset you in the presentation, can I ask, like Claire said, to please withdraw your projections? This is vulnerable enough for me to be talking about what I believe. If you think I'm some arrogant bastard, that's going to be even harder. It would be better if you could examine what it is that's irritating you as to find the edge of what it is that you believe in. Is that okay? So these aren't very... they're difficult presentations, but they're fun to do, right? So the kind of presentations are there to ask one singular question, and there are 3 movements that we're going to look at, as you might have seen in the emails, of which one of them, the singular question is really, what do we believe in? And is the stories that we've got large enough to meet our 21st century challenges? So not I, not you, but what do we believe in necessary to bind around collective action? Now, possibly in the dialogues, there could be, we don't need to believe together, to get things done together. But I want to show you some of the implications of what happens when that fragments, and also what happens when creeds or beliefs are actually held together. It's sufficient, I think, for me to act like James Hillman, who's a depth psychologist, to diagnose the culture. Okay, so Hillman puts the culture on the couch, including psychology. I actually think parts of psychology is buggered. Like Hillman, because it's looking at reformation and not transformation. So it puts people back into the same story, it seems. And I wanted to talk about the Western dreaming because the idea is to examine our dreaming, because I remember with Indigenous people, and I've worked with some of the stuff in the Indigenous area, that to kill a culture, you have to do 3 things to their cosmology. The first one is to say that your gods don't exist. The second one is that your laws don't work. And the third one is that your elders can't be trusted. Your gods don't exist, your laws don't work, and your elders can't be trusted. The problem, it seems to me, is we're doing that exactly to our own culture, and we don't know it. So, our gods don't exist, our elders can't be trusted, and our laws don't work. When you work with Indigenous cultures around their dreaming, they're absolutely imperative to keep it together beyond and before anything else, because it's necessary to bind their culture. Dreaming is essential, but they aren't the only people that have a culture. To give you an example, the best definition of anthropology is the study of a culture by a culture who thinks they don't have one. Which I think is brilliant. So it's only the Western people that could objectify something else sufficiently for it to be not like them. Does that make sense? So I want to look at doing that to ourselves. Now, I'm going to be using 3 essential writers. So there's 3 movements, and the first one we're going to be sort of taking work from this book called The Passion of the Western Mind by Richard Tarnas. It's quite a heavy tome, but it's brilliant, and it sets the kind of foundations of the basic philosophical and social and cultural tenets of the West. He's gone a bit nuts in some of his propositions, how about that? Not him, but I think he's gone a bit too far. But this is a brilliant book if you want to kind of know. So it goes from pre-Socratic all the way up to postmodernism. So we'll be sort of kind of doing a bit of that stuff, and I'm exploring the sort of grand narratives from this particular book today. G'day, guys. The second one, the second presentation, I'm going to be sort of using work from, now that's sort of from philosophy. So this one has got more a theological perspective from Gil Bailey, which is actually called Violence Unveiled. This is working off from a lot of work from René Girard around the idea of violence and making violence sacred. Now, the reason why I'm using his work is because I'm going to contrast subjectivity from Augustine and the subjectivity of Rousseau. As a psychologist, it seems to me that the major problem of collective action for Western people is what they're subject to. So the notions of where you're subject to has a real definite impact, it seems, on how we can get ourselves together. And the second presentation fascinates me more than all the others, is our subjectivity. And the proclamation of the two confessions, okay? The confession of Augustine and the confession of Rousseau, and how compelling both of those stories are. The third and the most controversial, and I hope you stay for the three of them, because they're a bit of a journey, is this one. It's a bit of a crazy book, but I really like it. And I reread it on the weekend, called The Wreck of the Western Culture, Humanism Revisited. And he also wrote a book called The Western Dreaming, Ego and the Soul and the Existential Jesus. Now, the reason why I wanted to present John Carroll's work is two things. He's a sociologist, so we're going to look at the sociology of things. And he's also, from my understanding, is an atheist. I'm not sure, but he's certainly someone that's grappling with the grand narrative of Christ, which comes in and out of the Western story to kind of irritate our understanding of our own cosmology. So Christianity has a bad rap, and it has that for good reason, but it's something that he talks about between the two great stories of these guys, the ambassadors, and we'll be talking about those ambassadors on the third, which is the ambassador of science and the ambassador of religion, and Holbein's genius of his almost prophetic witness of what the humanist project means and its implications on our identity. Is that okay? So this is reasonably dense stuff. You're not meant to get it, so that's okay. But if it kind of moves you a bit sufficiently, then I feel that I've done something worthwhile. I've only got a couple of slides, so really there's only three questions that a culture is meant to actually produce as a cultural product, which is where am I from, which is the origin of things, how do I live a life, which is what should I do ethically, and the third is what happens when I die, which is a metaphysical question. All cultures are, or at least somehow responsible, and if they're not responsible, at least try and grapple with them. Buddhism does it in a certain way, Christianity does it in a certain way, and humanism does it in a certain way. But those three essential questions are really important. The origin of things, the life to be lived, and what happens when I die. And those are tectonic shifts in our dreaming, but they are the purposes of culture. So what I want to do today is just to set the scene of some of these great stories. And the first one is really the first story of Socrates. Is that okay? Good. Now Socrates is very much like Christ in terms of the story of the Western dreaming, because it's sacrificial. Now here's the important bit that Tarnas is saying that I like. He says that in order for a new idea to emerge, something else has to die, right? So in order for a new argument, a new way of seeing the world, something has to kind of go. So that's really important. So each of these great stories challenge a certain kind of way of seeing that then leads to a new way of seeing the world. Now the first one is really the Hellenic sacrifice. And what that is essentially that Socrates is sacrificed against the gods. Now in the Hellenic world there were many gods, right? So there was lots of different forms of reality, of which, depending on how you read them, are kind of the playthings, right, of human beings. So Western people, and this is kind of important folks, were subject to fates. So they were subject to something other than their own will. What has that got to do with anything? Quite a lot. Because a lot of modern psychology says that you can create your own reality or dream your own dream. Not for the Hellenists. They said that there is this kind of fateful interplay between the gods and man, right? What's that got to do with anything? If you haven't read Freud, Freud midrashes or retells a lot of the Hellenic stories. Oedipus, right? All of those stories are in the canon of the Hellenic way of seeing the world. Now Socrates says something different. He comes up and he says, look, and the other similarity to Socrates, by the way, is he never wrote a word. Did you know that? Okay, Plato wrote the dialogues of Socrates. Nor did Christ, nor did Buddha. So the biggies don't seem to write stuff. Why, I don't know. They just don't. But other people are inspired enough to write, and Plato does. Now, in this story, Socrates is sacrificed because of corrupting the youth of Athens. Everyone's familiar with the story. He takes hemlock and dies. If you've ever read the book, it's one of the few books that I've read that's really wept. And that story I wept. I mean, the ethic of Socrates to do something. And it's this, and it's the responsibility. He says to think for yourself, right? So he introduces Socratic logic into our way of seeing for the world. And it's incredibly compelling. But you see, in the sacrifice, the gods condemn Athens. So the Athenian world starts to break. The gods start to loosen their hold on our imagination. Can you see what's going on? Because this goes all the way through our culture. All the way through it. And it's the birth of Western philosophy, of which, folks, there's only the four. Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, and the other one I've forgotten. We all go back to them, and we pay a great debt to them, particularly Aristotle in the religious sense, Aristotle and Plato. But this idea of the sacrifice is interesting, that he challenges the Hellenic world, but he says something unlike Christ, and I'll go to Christ later. He's asking for a sacrifice, but not one of the same proclamation of Yeshua, okay, of Jesus, a different kind of sacrifice. I have this particular little painting on my desk at home, and it's from Caravaggio. Does anyone know Caravaggio? That's a painter, right? I mean, this guy kind of gets it. And I think that might even be him. He often painted himself or prostitutes that he slept with as Madonna and Mary and a whole bunch. He was brilliant. Anyway, that's besides the point. The Hebraic sacrifice comes into our culture something like a bolt out of the blue. And I'm going to kind of use a guy called Kierkegaard here. And he says, look, there are three kinds of lens to see the world. The first one is the aesthetic, the second one is the moral, and the third is the religious. Okay? So this is, anyone from a Jewish background here? Man, they are like storytellers par excellence. I mean, there's a great book called The Jew and the Lotus Flower, right? So all these Jewish rabbis go to Dharamsala to talk to the Dalai Lama. And they have this dialogue, and the Dalai Lama says to the rabbis, you know, like our culture's under threat, you know, how did you keep it alive for 3.5 years? To the rabbis, and the rabbis said something brilliant. They said, tell your stories in the family. Right? It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. It holds and binds. So this is one of the foundational stories of the Jewish consciousness, and what it is a single proclamation of one source of reality. Okay? If you can just imagine how incredibly brave that kind of proclamation is, that there aren't many gods in the Hellenic sense, there's just one singular source, but something had to happen. In order for it to happen, the transcendent, I mean, is that Abraham had to do something that was aesthetically disgusting, which is to kill your son, morally implausible, which is to do that and then go back and try and live a normal life in response to that command, and then the religious one, which is the proclamation of building and binding that all together. So this poor guy has to go away from his own country, and for 3 days he's preparing this. And even his son, Isaac, is saying, where's the goat, right? Where's the sacrificial goat? So he's holding all this tension. Now, the reason why I keep this as a picture on my office is that at this sacrificial point, the transcendent is held away from the act. This is the moment where the transcendent meets the physical, right? It's the very moment in the Hebrew culture where it's the touch between the two worlds. But it had to come through a notion of obedient violation. So this seems to me this idea of the two coming together, and there's a dialogue ever since, which is the seeking and the dialogue with transcendence. It's an incredibly powerful story. But what happens is God condemns polytheism, and there's a singular proclaim or proclamation of truth, of which there are three religions that come from that. Yep, people familiar with that, with the Abrahamic? And if you want to know what's going on, the big conflicts in the West at the moment, or actually all around the world, is one big family feud between those three proclamations of truth. Who owns it? What is it? And one way of dealing with that, which is what we've been dealing with, is to try and ignore it. Is that okay? So, and we'll be talking about the flights in the last presentation. I just want to sort of set the scene tonight. Religion breaks through religare to bind together the transcendent and the physical through a violation, a seemingly violation. And we'll have a dialogue around it. So this one is one that I must admit, as a in a contemplative practice, fascinates me as much as other people who follow this faith. Is that we're not talking about Christianity here. We just want to talk about Christ. So I don't want to sort of kind of get into how Christianity is buggered and all that sort of stuff. I actually just want to talk about the story of Christ. Now, what we're getting back to with this story here is that it somehow both disturbs and fascinates the Western imagination. So it's one that kind of creeps underneath people's beds at night and upsets us. And the response of Christ is basically a sacrifice of non-violent action. And how do we know it? Well, Gandhi gets it. Gandhi knows how to operate culturally the implications of a non-violent response to the world. So you've got this sacrifice of someone who's a rabbi who doesn't fight back. So this kind of maddening idea that the best thing to do in terms of our response to power is to subject ourselves, to undergo, to say nothing, to endure, which comes from the word passio, right? Passion comes from the word endurance. To endure the subjugation of the powers to actually bring a different form of reality. And the form of reality he's actually proclaiming is that God is love, right? And that love is actually a non-violent generated response to the world. Now how that gets worked out throughout our history has been good and bad, and I'll explain some of that, but this particular story irritates the West more than any other story, it seems. And there are different ways of interpreting it. What's the most important story around the Christian proclamation? It's very similar to the Buddhist one, but from a very different approach. Is that Christ proclaims the death of death. It's an absolutely essential and important metaphysical proclamation in a culture. It's absolutely essential. And why is it essential? Because for a psychologist would know that where people are really held against the fire is right against the great existential questions. Well, should I live or should I die? Now, if you don't believe me, then look into the skull of Yorick, right? I know him well. In Hamlet, he midrashes this response to how the West is coping with its third question, what do we do with death? So the proclamation of a resurrected person God, or what Christians call the scandal of particularity, that a transcendence could be so particular in a person that it's hard to even imagine, you see. So this kind of story proclaims the death of death. The interesting thing is that by the 15th century, a lot of people were saying, to hell with it. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong, I'm saying that's what's been battling out ever since. Okay, so our institutional structures are really doing, and this poor story, this poor fella, we're going to come back to again and again, not because it's something that we are responding to in some way, shape or form, and often not very well. It slams the Greco and Roman culture into each other because the stories are written in Greek, but they're an import. The story occurs actually not in the West, but in the Near East. It comes into and slams into the West. And we've been kind of irritated by it ever since. Now here's the important bit, is that he is crucified because his proclamation of being. He says, I am. I am. So he actually is midrashing the kind of Hebrew proclamation of one source of reality, of being. I'm the solid ground of which one can deal with death. Hence all the psalms and stuff that get held in Christian witnesses. So he's different to Socrates because he actually asks a question. He asks one of Peter, which is kind of interesting because we're back to Credo. Is he says to Peter, who do you say that I am? Right? So if anyone is a member of the scripture. And basically Peter says, well, you're the risen Christ. You're it. And he says something a bit pragmatic for a fisherman, which is, where else are we to go? These are serious concerns for a culture. Where am I going to go? Into more money, more power, get more boats? Where am I to go? This is the sufficient answer to the death of death. And so he's asking a very different question to Socrates. His question is about being, not about epistemology. Now, the interesting thing about Credo, back to belief, is that his proclamation of I am is a question to everybody at every age. He's not asking that of Peter. He's asking that of every person who's heard the story. Is it true that it's resurrected, or is he just another figment of our imagination, a construction, a defence against death? There's Freud. He's actually an opiate of the people. That's Marx. You see what's going on. So you've got to to move away from this fella, you've got to kill him. You have to get and wipe him off the horizon, which is Nietzsche, and we'll go into that stuff as we go. So Nietzsche is really trying to deal with these really big questions, and the humanists have been battling it out ever since, and Dawkins and all of those, and on it goes. But you've got to wipe this fella off the scene. But he's not the full end of the story as we move a little forward. Whoops. It's two more to go, and then what we'll do is we'll take a break. Is that okay? So you've got these stories of the Hellenic sacrifice, you've got the Hebrewic sacrifice, one reality, one ultimate source of reality, not different realities. Sacrifice through non-violent response to the world, because that's the nature of reality, so God is love. And then you've got this other one where Aristotle holds sway over the Western Catholic imagination. So Aristotle basically says that there is kind of a geocentrism, right? So we're in a safe place, folks, in the West at the moment. We stand on reasonably good terra firma because everything revolves around us. Is that okay? But then logic and reason starts to have its effect, and wonderful effect. Remember, I love science, I love reason. And it starts to have it starts to pull the firm place of where the West stands underneath its very feet. So I didn't talk about Archimedes. Archimedes says, give me a place to stand and I can move the world, yeah? Now, we need to probably move our world. There's a good chance that there are things that we're facing that we have to do something about, right? But we need a firm place to stand in order to move it. There has to be a firm fulcrum. But what's happened is the ground keeps shifting under our Western cosmology. And this is one of the great ones, which is brilliant. So the universe revolves around us, by the way, but it doesn't revolve around me. That comes later. You getting what I'm saying so far? We haven't got to the me yet. But we're in the me world at the moment. But the first kind of fracture of that place is that the world revolved around us, the geocentric. And then with some very good, clever calculations of ratio to weigh up rationality, there's a proclamation, sorry folks, we actually revolve around it, the heliocentric view. The church wants nothing of it. And the reason is because of its theological terra firma is now being ripped asunder, and with it, all its great stories. Can you see the implications? These are massive tectonic shifts in our storytelling that are necessary, that people have written about for ages. Byron and Shelley and all the poets and all the artists and all the, right, are writing around this. T.S. Eliot, his 4 quartets, right? It's right there in the canon, is that the ground underneath us is shifting, and the first major shift, it seems, apart from the other ones that I talked about, is Galileo. So Galileo defends the Copernican revolution around the 16th century, and it's found to violate Holy Scripture. So it doesn't hold under the theological weight. And geocentrism is now abandoned, and the place where the church stands is cracked. And the birth of ratio and rationality now begins, and it's being tearing along at a pace. Yeah? But it has its own limitations. That too starts to tire, starts to wither. And we'll be talking a little bit about that in the second one if you're interested in coming as the story evolves. But the rise of the 3 great humanist credos start to emerge as this starts to crack. And the great 3 humanist credos, the 3 beliefs of the humanists, is reason. I'm not saying these are right or wrong, I'm just saying what they are, diagnostically. The self and the will. So willingness, subjection to God, to mystery itself, is now abandoned for reason. And these two are now being squaring off ever since in our culture. And the fragmentation of that squaring off, I would say as a psychologist, gives rise to lots of pathology, lots of illness, lots of... because these important questions need some terra firma. And when they get pulled underneath us, things start to kind of look a little bit shoddy. Now, because of this kind of great victory over the church and its proclamation of truth, the rationalists take on everything. And what they marry with science is technology. Yeah? And technology becomes a basic handmaiden of science. And it brings in the final one, which is then we can have a discussion about. A philosopher said something, and it's this one, which is the anthropocentric sacrifice, of which is where we're in now. I forgot who the philosopher was, but I like what he said. He said that in the logos of technology is speed. You want to say that again? In the logos, in the logic, in the very logic of technology is speed. I think we were talking about this to your students about sustainability. So what comes out of technology is a quickening, yeah? Has anyone noticed things are getting a bit overwhelming? It's because the dreaming, yeah? Well, it's because the dreaming that we're immersed in is a technological scientific dreaming of efficiency. It's one of the 4 holding points of Aristotle, which is the efficient cause. But it abandons one that Aristotle talks about, which is the final cause, or teleos, the end of things, which are necessary for a cosmology to survive. Remember I was talking about for a cosmology to survive, we need to know how things end, how a story ends. Now science is brilliant, but it has its own proclamations. And the proclamation that comes with science, particularly in the logos of technology and speed, is one of the other great demolishers who was brilliant, was Darwin. But Darwin has a crack at one of Aristotle's idea of the original cause, which is that we are not born out of the love of God or the image of God, but from amoeba. Or another way of saying it, we'll be talking about these, if you want to know your origin, man, look at an ape. So he demolishes the whole idea of us as being something higher or worthy. Now the ultimate implications, possibly, existentially, is that we aren't worthy of anything, which includes the survival of us on the planet. Right? So you hear one of these teleos, like Lovelock, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, says it won't matter, the earth will survive. Now for a Christian, that's abhorrent. Not because we're better, but because we're created in the image of God. That is, that the origin of us comes from love. Now, for Catholics, it's not a problem. If it started from the amoeba upwards, no problems. It explains how things happen. So Catholics don't have a problem with it. Certainly some of the Protestant evangelicals do, and it's because from their origin came around the same time of the Enlightenment debate. So the kind of idea of saying that the origin isn't born out of mystery, Augustine, but actually out of amoebas, it does two things. It creates a narrowing of proclamations of truth. So all of a sudden, the stories of poetry and literature and music are playthings, but they're not real things, yeah? They're not things that proclaim and investigate truth, they're kind of secondary. So if nothing falls under the rubric of efficient cause, it's not worthy of our investigation. So the philosophy departments die, the poetry and literature stuff suffers because they suffer under the weight of the credo of rationality alone. Do you see what happens in that? So we're back to this strange problem of eating ourselves from different proclamations. Man is diminished, but he's handy. And what's the problem with it? Is that, remember I was talking about me? So we move from us to me, and we'll talk about Rousseau. But I become the centre of all things, which means that my self-expression and my understanding of things is more important than anything else. And isn't that self-evidently true? And so I think that gives rise to consumptive capitalism and a whole bunch of stuff where, well, let me paraphrase it, I've said it in 100 lectures before, the West could never create a wee pod, but just iPods. You see what I mean? Is that the central self is so important. And it's a notion of freedom, and I'm not against it. But here's the problem with it. If it takes 400 billionaires to kind of realise that that's not where it's at. Are you with me so far? But the ecosystems that give rise to that realisation buckles underneath the weight of that form of dreaming. We've got a problem. Houston, we have a problem. The problem, as I was saying to the sustainability kids, and I shouldn't say it, they break my heart. Yeah, I know, I'm a Gen Xer, but it breaks my heart because the kind of wiping the earth, our cosmology, our love for the transcendent, our restraint in relation to that reality, and letting it rip as a way of proclamation of freedom may not be our way out of the problem. So the question is, how many billionaires do we need to find out that they go, it's not where it's at, folks, so I'm going to set up a new trust for people to sort it out. How many people have to kind of get compelled with the Western dreaming of consumptive self? And technology is the handmaiden of it, not theology. Now, I just want to end with this. We okay? We're going okay with this? Because if the ecosystems are sacrificed, it's the earth that's condemning something. And that's the question I'd like to kind of talk about. What's emerging now as we go forward with these ways of being? Has anyone ever read the victory speech from Osama bin Laden after the smash of the Two Towers? It's very telling because it says something from another culture about what they think we value. Stay with me with this. He gets a whole bunch of planes, uses our own technology with the simplest of technologies, which is a knife, right, box cutter, and rams them into certain places in the West, but he doesn't ram them into the Vatican. He doesn't ram them into the Abbey Church in London. He doesn't ram them into the theological schools, right? For him, they're buggered. They don't hold the Western imagination. He rams them into the towers of commerce. And he says something not like this, but not completely, I'm paraphrasing it. If this is what you guys believe in, which is the transaction of homo economicus, the transaction of value, we can bring it down. What he's saying is ontologically, as Lubac, who's a theologian, says, that there is a thinning of ontological density. I'll finish with this, and we can unpack this forever, but I'd rather you guys reflect and think. But it's important because I'll bring a little bit of Hillman in here with the poor and the Senex. Technology is about quickening things, making them faster. So there's youth and freshness in them. We fetish the young in the Western culture. We have very little respect for our elders. Because technology will save us. Because it's brilliant. Look what it does. But the problem with it is it doesn't have a cosmology, I think, large enough for the whole 9 yards to deal with those three questions of culture. And it seems to me that people from other cultures that come from a credo, and I'm not a Muslim, but they only have one credo. Do you know that? I'm sure you all know it. That there is only one God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. One creed. It's the fastest growing religion in human history. So this guy is puncturing at something where he's saying the ground on which these people stand is fragile. The Archimedean point, if they push it, will collapse underneath its own weight. And it's because, and I am passionately a Western person. I stayed in my tradition because I wanted to be an Occidental. I didn't want to run to the East. And I actually supervised a professor of psychiatry from Beijing University for a year, Professor Xiaohui Wen, wonderful woman. They are trying to learn everything we've got. So we may not find it there. But the point is that these are the great stories that we're all grappling with. And I'll finish with this. None of these stories have gone away. They disturb us in our sleep. They inspire us in our work. They keep us outraged and also comforted, depending on which story you're willing to align your belief. Who do you say you are in relation to those stories? And it's a question that we all have to ask. The credo of the Nicene Creed, the Catholic Church buggered it again, said we believe in the one God. I've turned it back to the singular, which is actually not the original Greek, which is I believe. The problem with that is that I'm not interested in what I believe, but us strong enough to hold the challenges ahead with particularly this particular one. I think I'll finish it there. I hope you've got some thinking with that. Well, it gets better.
Yeah, he's going to have a solution for it.
No.
trying. Love